Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning here at the Biotherapies Pavilion. My name is Kate Fry, and I'm the CEO of America's Blood Centers. And it is my pleasure to moderate today's panel on making it work, real examples of custom-fit care in biotherapies. For those of you not familiar with America's Blood Centers, we are the national organization representing community blood centers across the United States and Canada. So I think, and I want to first actually thank the Blood and Cells Advocacy Roster, BCAR. They are an industry collaboration that formed about a year ago to promote increased awareness on blood center capabilities in the blood and advanced therapy space. And this session is just one of many events that great group has hosted. And so I did want to get to our wonderful panel, but first I just wanted to summarize some of the work that BCAR has done over the last year and why we're talking about this important topic. And it's really because blood centers are uniquely positioned within the advanced therapies space to help promote increased access and capabilities in the area, whether it be the expertise that blood centers have around apheresis collections, both from donors and patients, donor recruitment, infectious disease testing, quality control, manufacturing, distribution. I think they do it all. And obviously the decades of experience that we have in the blood space have well prepared us to transition now to this new arena. And so I'll just start by introducing our panel. First, we have Scott Grady, Associate Director of Product Portfolio Strategy at Versity. Becky Kapp, Senior Vice President of Biotherapies at Vitalant. Heather Munoz, Principal Global Market Development at BBG Advanced Therapies. And Trevor Smith, who has a new title, so congratulations, Trevor, which is Cell and Gene Therapy Market Expansion Lead for Terumo BCTs. So welcome, everyone. Why don't we get started? If each of you could just take a couple of minutes and talk about how you are making it work within your organizations and maybe one or two examples of your capabilities in terms of recent work with customers.
Suppose we'll just move down the line. So from a Versity's perspective, as far as making it work, what we're doing, new, and I know a couple of my colleagues here have done this even a little bit more recently than we have, but we're very much integrating some of the things that we've done in a legacy service portfolio for cellular therapies in the past, whether that's dendron collections and autologous therapies where we're integrated into the healthcare systems, specifically in Milwaukee and in the Grand Rapids area, performing frontline apheresis collections for I think at least 6 clinically approved therapies. They're doing cellular processing and setting those off for manufacture and support of those therapies. But then we've also established unique donor bases for allogeneic therapy development, where we're supporting novel developers that are in phase 1 in the clinic with a handful of companies there. That registry was actually built out of our center in Austin, Texas, which is where we have central laboratory services, and our clinical trials side of the house supports these sorts of companies as well, from not only central lab services managing the clinical trials, but also our HLA testing capabilities performs inclusion criteria testing for trials in, for example, CAR TCR for solid tumor and things of that nature. So one of the specific ways where we make it work, especially in the allo side, my panel here and folks in the audience will probably recognize that everything is always custom. And you start with one donor criteria and move on to the next. And so our donor base that we established in that regard is fully characterized for infectious disease and HLA. But I think the panel yesterday here even discussed the mass amount of infectious disease testing and requirements that are done there as well. And so we work specifically, I can't get too detailed here, but we're specifically for novel therapy developers, identifying donors, narrowing down to their selected donors that meet their criteria, and then managing that pool as far as recall. And we do that specifically for each developer. And so all of these efforts are highly customized to each developer. And again, I'm sorry I have to be so high level.
So I think this whole industry, if we want to call it that right now, is making it work. It's not just the blood centers, it's the therapeutic developers, it's the hospitals. We're trying to figure this out. We've got we have a base of science that's really exciting, but getting that to be a commercial and clinical reality requires a lot of creativity. The thing that I'm really excited about from a blood center standpoint is that if you look at the infrastructure needed to deliver these therapies, to collect the products, get them processed, manage the logistics back to the manufacturer, manage the logistics back to the hospital, we have 70 to 80% of that infrastructure for each of those functions. So the incremental add is pretty minimal compared to a fresh build in every community where these therapies are needed. So it's that mindset, that growth mindset, and that creative, how do we use what we already have to make it work? So an example, and I talked about this yesterday in our session about the last mile delivery. Our cell therapy lab has been working with bone marrow transplant programs for years. They're doing cryopreservation and processing, but the hospitals don't have a place to store the finished product, and the alignment on when the product gets manufacturing's done, but that alignment between therapy being ready and patient being ready is not perfect yet. And so having a place to store the product, having a team to take the product to the clinic, thaw it, or the clinical setting, thaw it, and prep it for infusion. I think that is messy. We have about 5 ways we're doing it right now because we're customizing it to the needs of the specific hospital. Eventually, that has to get streamlined, but for right now, it means accepting that kind of, uh, forgive me, but chaos and managing through it, to help support getting these therapies out.
So how are we making it work at BioBridge Global Advanced Therapies? I think, to piggyback off with what Becky and Scott are saying is there's a really collaborative approach that we need to do. And we need to look at what the developers are doing, also, the blood centers, and then also the clinical sites. But we need to look at what policy is going on too and what's going on in the FDA and the motives that we're doing. So patient access is something that we're really focusing on. And how do we get cells to the patients, right, in an efficient manner? Our supply chain is very unique and autologous, right? It starts with the patient and goes back to the patients, not a typical supply chain that we typically see. So one of the things at BioBridge Global that we're doing is we're focusing on patient access. We're getting invoices from, the voices of the patients, also the developers, and, the hospital sites and the clinical trial centers, organizations, and what they're really expecting and what they need and what the gaps are. So at BioBridge Global, we do have a mobile leukapheresis center to help impact those patients who can't get to the authorized treatment centers that are typically in big cities. And a lot of people in Texas, they don't live, near a big city and academic center. So that is one of the things that we're doing, is seeing how can we get to the rural communities. I know Dendreon is one that a lot of people work with. They go into the community centers and they do collections to reach those populations. And it's something that we're hoping to do for the other cell therapies as well.
All right, and so how Terumo is making it work, obviously we make a little device called the Spectroptia that I think a few people here might be familiar with. But, the install base is overwhelming. We're at blood centers, we're at hospitals, we're, kind of everywhere. So it's almost a bit like who but us, being a patient-centric organization, making these devices that enable these therapies, to be more involved and to kind of, and expand the access that patients can have to them. So specific examples, obviously the device provider, we stand by the quality of it, but there's so much more to it. With the services that we offer for optimizing collections, whether that's the settings for the device to improve yield, whether that's taking a step deeper and marrying data sets from the device to, who the patient is, what the cells look like coming off of it, and getting algorithms to say like, okay, if based on a pre-count, this is what, your device settings need to be to hit your target yield. It's really it's incredible what can happen when like these kinds of collaborations can come together. We also do training. You know, it's not just the device settings, it's saying what the product is doing, but who is the user interfacing with it, and you know what do you need to do to make sure that every site within the network is operating at its optimal and peak. And so a specific example, we actually just had a webinar, I think 2 weeks ago with NA Bio, that they're a smaller biotech that they're doing gamma delta T cells. And they had things figured out for phase 1 for collections, but when they started getting into the phase 2, they saw things start changing, or they saw variability increasing. And they thought, well, let's, you know, talk to Terumo and you know, work on the Optia. And I'll let you guys watch the webinar. I won't spoil the ending, but you know, they were very happy with the partnership that we could provide and ultimately benefiting the patients.
Awesome. I love it. I love all the different ways that each of you are making it work. So why don't we start a little bit with the autologous space, right? This is really where blood centers have cut your teeth in terms of the cell therapy experience. And so what has worked well in this space from your perspective, whether it be on the patient, starting material, manufacturing, regulation, or hospital partnerships?
I'd say for us, it's been hospital partnerships first. Our nurses were in there doing therapeutic apheresis. Those are very sick patients. It wasn't a big step to have them do patient collections for the hospitals, and that extended their capacity. But as we think about this conundrum, and I love the fact that there is such variability. We all have different communities. We have different footprints, skill sets. As we've been thinking about talent, about how to create access pathways for these patients, it's been about leveraging footprint that might not have been used for cell therapy before. So we have these nurses in different cities, but we have facilities all over. So could we, as patients get earlier line, could we do those collections literally in their community and send them out for processing regardless of where they get treated? Could we leverage collaborations to extend that even further? What are the things, the unlikely partnerships where if you look at what is the need? Is it footprint? Is it real estate? Is it transport? Is it storage? How can we work together to make that happen? I think this is that creative space. Part of making it work is looking for the partnerships that make sense for where we are today.
It just you know, kind of pile on there. I believe that the answer there could be different based on every center's geography from a blood center perspective. You know, from the awesome bus, you know, that you guys have, right? That might not play in a big city environment. You don't need that. So our experience at Versity is very similar to Vitalence as far as getting in there with therapeutic apheresis, and the hospital relationships are always very tight and they work well. But I think the expansion and the democratization of these therapies, right, is a big challenge. And I think from a blood center perspective, every geography and every center is going to have to look and work specifically within the hospital and patient need within your areas, and come up with the creative solutions that you know, that are going to drive, you know, this next level of care that they're all pursuing, right?
So there's 3 models right now that we have for doing autologous collections. They can be done in the hospital with a clinical staff if a patient's inpatient. But there are patients who don't need to be treated in an inpatient setting. They're typically get their chemo in an outpatient setting, or they're in an autoimmune condition, which would make them, you know, they don't want to go to a hospital and be inpatient and have a collection done. So there's another model there where we could have a blood center roll in their apheresis machine and do the procedure in an outpatient setting, or they could go into the rural communities at those oncology clinics and do the apheresis with a bus outside. I think there's a different model, and not just one works. We need to all work together, which is why we're all sitting here on this panel today. That we need to work with the hospitals, we need to work with the community centers, and we need to work with the blood centers to be able to attract a lot of patients to get cell therapy, because the biggest access issues are logistics. And, you know, patients can't afford to, you know, leave their family, go into a hospital for a day, travel 4 to 5 hours away. The logistics there aren't, you know, possible for a lot of people.
I like all those settings that have been mentioned of where these collections can take place because regardless if it's at a hospital, a blood center, or on a bus now, we want to make sure that, every collection is the best collection that it can be, right? And give patients the chance that they have, not just as a function of their access to it geographically, but oftentimes they get one shot on goal. And it's kind of like, how do you ensure that that shot is the one for them to have a therapy at the other side of all of this stuff? So I think the autologous space, they definitely benefit from being established now. We have the FDA approved therapies already on market. So they've had the time to start thinking, what can we do about the process? And I remember at the start of things, it was always the process is the product. Maybe people remember that mantra. And it was just, it was up to the manufacturing process to fix any deficiencies in cell collections. I feel like that has changed a lot now, and people are starting more and more to see cell collections as a piece of the manufacturing process that you can make changes to at the optimization level for autologous. And, do you really have to spend 7 years optimizing manufacturing process to bring it from, 2 weeks to a couple days if you would just started with optimized starting material? Like would you need that kind of investment? I think it's an interesting time for us, and I'm really happy to see, both sides of the equation now starting to talk to each other more.
Okay, can I give a shout out to the folks at Terumo? Because years ago, you guys did research and published SOPs on how to move an Optia around. And that's been key to the portability and taking the burden off of each center every time they want to move something. And so that, I don't know that you've gotten enough credit for that, but wanted to at least give you a shout out today.
I do appreciate it. I mean, and now especially with a bus, like, we're really putting that to the test. So it's yeah, yeah,
That's next level portability.
yeah, exactly.
All right, well, why don't we then shift to the allo space, right? And I think that's the natural next step in all of this, and a place that blood centers can probably really use their existing infrastructure and expertise. And so for those of you that are currently collecting in this space, maybe you can also talk about where, you see the opportunities, how you're making it work in this space.
Yeah, I think just like blood donation and everything that we've done historically, it all starts with building the relationship with the donors. And I think from a center perspective, it's a new way for them to interact with you, right? Versity has done this slightly differently, where we did not start, in our normal geography where we have our blood donors in the upper Midwest, but in a slightly different geography where we're around the quality and regulatory environments that support clinical trials. Because these environments are different, and the allo space right now is all in the clinical trial space. So you have to kind of go about the way you interact with that donor base differently than maybe you would on a altruistic blood donor side of the house. But so as we built that out, it's the management of that base, right, is again slightly different, especially than when you identify the ones needed for therapies and the ones that are successful down the road. Because there is no such thing, or we have not found yet a super donor, if you want to use that term. There was I missed the talk last night, but there's a great talk about identifying those sorts of donors and trying to predict manufacturing processes. So maybe we're getting closer in that regard at other centers, but we'll see where it goes from there.
Okay, so the allo space is a very interesting one for me, as I used to work for a developer. So I have all this information of how to optimize donor collections for allogeneic. And as we move into the allogeneic world, there's a lot of, conversation about going over donor characteristics and having a highly characterized donor pool. So I think one of the things, I've taken away is making sure that we all work together to find a good donor pool, right? It's not going to be one supplier who's going to have all the donors for a specific developer. They're going to need to collaborate with other developers as well. There's the blood banks, there's also the bone marrow registries, and then there's also the clinical research organizations who have donors as well. And they all have specific things that can attract a developer. So understanding what they're looking for, who the customers are looking for. Are they looking for female donors? Do they need HLA? Do they need, flow cytometry? Having those characteristics available, I think, is important for the customer. And it's also, providing characterization is something that they need, right? Sometimes they don't even know what they need until later on down the road. And typically, a lot of us will make those relationships in preclinical, and then when we go through phase 2, we don't really want a super donor, right? That's a term that I despise, but there is no such thing as a super donor, and yeah. I think it's important, we collaborate together as allogeneic companies, and we go to these talks and we see what the developers are saying and how can we overcome it, because it's not a one size fit all solution.
Yeah, jump back in. You mentioned the we don't really know what we want yet until we know, right? The other thing that I'll encourage developers, I've been to a lot of different conferences and I see these panels and they'll have a starting material provider and a developer and a manufacturer, and then the manufacturer and then regulatory, but they never have the full value chain all connected, right? And I think we have to do a better job, especially in the allogeneic space, of opening up and saying, hey, what exactly do you need, and do you really need it? Because
Right.
honestly, there's a lot of stuff that you ask for, and I'm sorry, but scientists love the science, and they will start looking at any piece of data that they can get their hands on, and whether or not that's actually beneficial to your potency and efficacy of the product downstream is another thing entirely. So I would just encourage any developer, if you're working with an allogeneic provider, is open up, give us a little peek behind the curtain so that we understand what's happening downstream in the manufacturing process, how it helps you in the regulatory environments, and then we can come up with very creative solutions for you, because that's what we've done for decades.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've encountered really over the last decade is working with blood centers. There's been a lot of concern about if we recruit donors for biotherapies, are we going to damage our volunteer donor base, right? Are we going to have a challenge there? And I think what's really been exciting is looking at new ways to engage with populations. It's like, think broader. We're not targeting the donors that are in the volunteer blood donor base. We're targeting broad populations. So how do we think and talk to them differently? How do we engage them differently? How do we maintain that engagement? And I really appreciate some of the innovative companies that have come out either with software or gamification type protocols that really engage and think about who we're trying to pull in. So that's been a really exciting thing for us.
I think to piggyback off of that, it's just diversity in clinical trials is very limited, and donor diversity is also limited too. So for us to work together and to recognize that, that will only enhance the developers as they go into their pivotal phases as well. And, having centers in different parts of the country, even in the world, and working together to make sure that we're able to have a bigger patient access pool in the future.
And I think from a device perspective for allogeneic, like a collection is a collection, but whether you're doing autologous or allogeneic, the goals for each collection may be different, right? An autologous, I talked about the best shot on goal for a patient. For allogeneic, it's kind of like, how do you almost maintain a security of supply? Like this is the raw material for a drug product. So the definition of success changes somewhat when you get into the allo space. And I think, to your point, with diversity, it only speaks to the fact that we need to fill the map with places that can not just intake patients, but also donors, and get that level of diversity, and get that there's not going to be a super donor, I don't think. I'd be surprised, or they're going to be in very high demand. So how do we get, such a broad pool that it meets the needs of as many therapies as possible, and thus have that patient impact? So
Super donors make me think of future like doomsaying movies, right? Like we're gonna put these anyway.
Yeah,
This,
very sci-fi.
I'm really regretting the fact I said a super donor now, but
Well, we're going to keep it. So
again, just another shout out to Terumo. So this is like the Terumo praise side over here, I guess. But you talked about the supply chain, and any sort of developer is going to be wanting to standardize as much as possible, right? And they're going to want the same input to their process, right? And and same results coming out the manufacturing side. In the allo side, there's innate biology that is going to be different every single time, from collection to collection, definitely from donor to donor, right? And you guys have been able to kind of lean in and help us optimize a few things, when we see that variation. But we only get to see that if the developers open up, on the back end side and show us what's going on. So again, it especially in the allo side, I think it takes a lot of collaboration across the different pieces of the value chain in order to really unlock what's possible.
Yeah, there definitely needs to be a feedback loop between the downstream manufacturing and upstream. It's doubly so for allo, because it's like, how do you expect to improve overall for a manufacturing process that you're trying to make standard for a drug product? So,
All right, let's pivot a little bit. When I think about the traditional blood space, one of our lessons learned, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, has really been the power of local innovation, right? And allowing blood centers to find their own way to make it work. And so that being said, and I've heard that echoed in each of your comments, right? That local impact, understanding your partners, understanding your communities is really essential to that. That being said, are there things that need to happen at the national level in a more coordinated way to reduce barriers and increase opportunities for blood centers in this space?
Reimbursement strategy. That the apheresis piece is sorry, this is like everywhere I go, and talking to some of the developers. Some are taking the approach of, okay, we're just going to do this because we're gonna pay for the apheresis, and we're gonna make it work because that's the only way to expand our patient base. Others are really struggling with this, with the fact that third-party reimbursement it isn't going to the hospital. It's quote unquote part of the manufacturing component, and it just gets ping ponged back and forth. And so it's like, how do we untangle that so that, and that's a tiny little piece, but right now it's holding up at least a couple of major pharma companies from figuring out how to expand from here. And I have yet to meet a blood center that's really interested in doing third-party reimbursement filings for apheresis procedures. We're making it work, but that's a little much.
I think of like the regulatory environment, right? I mean, the difference between, like you mentioned, our legacy blood products, right? We know that if it's labeled as a packed red blood cell, we know what's going to be in that bag. If it's labeled as a platelet product, we know the counts and what's going to be in that bag, right? Can anybody up here, anybody in the audience, tell me exactly definition of what a leukapheresis or leukopak product is, or it's all different, right? And so in a world that's screaming for COGS to come down and business models to improve and standardization to happen, but yet everything is custom from the collection all the way through everybody's manufacturing process and delivery to the patient. As much as we can get around to standardization, if that ever happens, I know you probably don't think it. I heard you yesterday, it never will. I'm kind of in your camp. But if there's a force, never say never. Yeah, but if there'd be a more alignment around that as a forcing function, I think that'd be very, very interesting to see the impact to all downstream processes.
I think as a apheresis nurse who's done collections, the national level and making it work is to have some kind of harmonization across the board, because developers are seeing variability between sites too, different suppliers. So that's one thing as well. And I know Trevor over here can help out with, making sure that we have this feedback model with the developers and the manufacturers, going back to the blood donor centers, being like, okay, we need to align this all together to make sure that when we bring a product to manufacturing, that it'll actually be sufficient and it'll be able to be delivered to a patient. So I think one of the things is apheresis, everybody kind of does their own thing. It's an art. We always say it's an art to do apheresis, but there are some gaps that need to be harmonized to make sure that we deliver the best products.
yeah, and I would say nationally, not to all great points, things I would say too, but I think communication above all. And I think that's not just limited to the collection site and the downstream manufacturers talking and establishing that feedback loop. We have a community of people at this show that have learned a lot in forging this path that can transfer those learnings to other. I think there's a role for everybody to play in this space. And even, I hear about some of the successes of like, well, okay, how does a blood center integrate with a hospital network? Not just for what they do day to day, but to expand into cell and gene therapy, or how do you, engage with a hospital you have no prior relationship with to get into cell and gene therapy, or maybe you're ready to do it and the hospital isn't, right? And so I think there's a lot of stories and learnings that, if we open up and kind of share and have a dialogue about it, we're going to get there faster.
I agree. And I don't, I wouldn't say we're never going to get to standardization, but we're going to go through a messy period for a while until we can get there.
Or whatever, a decade.
What's that?
So if we go into it for decades,
At
so
least,
yeah.
right? I mean, we've got another decade to go. Come on, Scott. But, but I already see people thinking differently, even about, and there's a clinic that we're working with where they're thinking about the guard bands around apheresis. Can you write something that's broad enough that gets most of the variability, but it still provides some framework for thinking about these things? So I don't want to be completely nihilistic about standardization. We need to think about where are the things that we can provide some structure to, so that we can get to one of my, a lot of people have heard this from me, but customized standardization, right? So you have a standardized framework and you tweak 20% of it to get to a best solution until we can really lock this down.
Yeah, it didn't even sound like Johnny Raincloud there, but no, I agree with you, and I think and this is ongoing now. I know at the national level, but even within our own centers, we're working on to this level with custom standardization. Okay, what's the table stakes, right? And this is when we're going to start here, and then we can add on this piece, that piece, and that's probably maybe what the future looks like. Yeah.
One thing that I think is so unique about blood center capabilities is really the value that you all have as a trusted community partner, right? And we've been talking a lot about the technical aspects of this and the manufacturing and all of that. But Becky, something you said yesterday really has stuck with me in terms of how few patients in the grand scheme of things have so far actually received these therapies, right? And so what is the role, the responsibility perhaps of the blood community as these therapies continue to become more prevalent, to get to more patients in serving as that trusted community partner?
So I guess I'll start with kind of a reminder. We are doing this now. Today we're talking about things that we are doing and a lot of stuff that we're looking at and thinking about doing. But it's really important to embrace the fact that we're in the middle of this, and we are that trusted partner with some of our hospitals. How do we expand that? One relationship at a time on one level. But I think it's also data. I've been thinking about this for a while. It's like, what can we do? What's the data set that helps give credibility when we're going to that new hospital or we're going to that new therapeutic developer? What is the data set that we can bring with us to say, look, we've done this. We know it's messy. We're prepared to meet you in the middle of the mess and figure it out. There's been a lot of talk about education, both to patients and to hospitals. I don't know that we're quite, we're doing a lot with national organizations, but when you get to a grassroots education level, I don't know. I don't know where we fit in. I'd be really interested in hearing what my fellow panelists think.
Yeah, I think patient education and even provider education is really the bottleneck. Being in cell and gene therapy, there's so many institutions that don't even implement cell and gene therapy because of many variables. A lot of it is education based. They just don't know what's going to happen to the patients. They hear about those patients that have been given the same chemo for years. They fail, they do a bone marrow transplant for some indications. That providers are scared to lose their patients, to transfer them to another facility and not be able to see their care through because they've been taking care of them for years. I think, they think it's taboo, cell therapy, some providers, especially in some parts of the country. And it's really the access issue, I think, is what it boils down to. And what we can do as blood centers is we're a trusted partner, right? We provide blood products to their hospitals for us to be able to talk on behalf of cell and gene therapy and deliver that same level of care. I think we'll go miles. and patients and donors too. Everybody donates for people. It's not something, that we're a new company coming in and saying we can fix the world and treat all these people. It's really leveraging, our experience to go into those organizations, and it can be integrated at a level or a national. But even the access to people having the national level education is another thing as well.
Yeah, agree to all the points that you made around education, but both of you. But I also think of, again, this is like I said, we've been doing it now. We've been doing it for a while. I think when you look at expansion and being able to kind of prove, okay, here's what we can bring to the table. We have been processing cells and logistics and all these pieces that go into the value chain, but it is a different environment and different application. And I think when you look at even workforce development and what we have within our centers now and what this is going to need in the future, I think we can also play a pivotal role not only educating patients and providers, but just our communities in general. Maybe that's even through donor base and getting more involved in local education programs for new and upcoming students and trying to build the next workforce that's going to be needed to run apheresis machines, to do flow cytometry, to do cell processing, those sorts of things. I think we can get more involved there. I know Versity does a variety of work within our local communities. Sue Johnson heads up a lot of that. But a broadening there could also be helpful as we look to the future.
And if I may pay a compliment back to my fellow panelists, I think, from our perspective, just seeing the willingness of the blood centers to get into this, like the confidence in like, yes, we can, and we're going to make it work. I see this kind of resilience to it, in engagement and finding a way. I think, with that as kind of a guide, like it's all possible. So.
We have a couple minutes left. Are there any questions out there from the audience? So for anyone that couldn't hear, the question was about apheresis capacity, and it's something that is struggling with other parts of the world, but how are we doing here in the U.S.?
From a general nationwide, what I've heard is if it's not a bottleneck today, it's going to be a bottleneck. And so from our Versity perspective and within our geography, I can say that what used to be problems maybe 3 or 4 years ago within this space are no longer problems as we've optimized those for current capacity in one area. That's not the same for the rest of our states and in the geography. So like I kind of led off with our, with the discussion of every center is going to be different, and you really need to work with your community hospitals that are within your geographies and within your catchment radiuses that where you think that you can help to understand where they're going, and if they don't have capacity, then what you can do to supplement that. But it's going to be different, but I'd say it broadly again, if it's not a problem now, it will be, especially as new applications come on board, solid tumor, autoimmune disease, things of that nature.
Yeah, 8 months to a year ago, we were going out talking to hospitals that were in our customer base already. And for most of them that had cell therapy programs onboarded, they were like, we got this. Okay, great.
And now what?
And we'll go to, and so I'm not looking to disrupt something that's working. I want to fill a gap. And so we went off and did that. And now we're hearing from some of those same centers, this is a lot harder to manage than we thought. We had capacity, now we're getting backlogs, we're shifting patients around. So it is becoming a problem, even in some of the major centers.
So the apheresis centers in the hospital, there's not a lot of them, right? They're in the big academic centers, and it's not just cell and gene therapy that we're doing, it's therapeutic procedures as well. And those are acute procedures. If somebody has a sickle cell crisis, they're about to have a stroke, that is going to trump it's one machine. They need to go and take care of that patient before they do a cell therapy collection because it can wait, unfortunately. So the prioritization of some of these centers in the hospitals is they have to treat the acute patients, and then the cell and gene therapy is on the backlog, which is where the blood centers can come in too, and they can do the therapeutic procedures or they can do the cell and gene therapies. Working at an institution where I ran an apheresis center, we still had a backup plan if we needed somebody to come in. So the need is still, I think there's gaps, right? We're not going to be able to predict. It's fight or flight. A lot of the times we might not have procedures at all, and then all of a sudden everybody needs to get treated at the same time.
Heather may have more insights to this than I do too, but I don't think the visibility is there across. So like when you mentioned those conflicts, that's kind of a like manage it as it comes up moments, and we don't have the technology or the platform that allows a look across from a scheduling standpoint, from a manufacturing standpoint, from a donor or patient management standpoint, a holistic solution as of yet, but we're working on it. I don't know if you can validate that, Heather.
Yeah, I think, just to add is like apheresis centers take a lot to build into a hospital, right? It's not a specialty that we're trained as nurses. A lot of us come from blood banking backgrounds, actually, like working at the Red Cross or other blood banks to learn apheresis. And then we get into a field. Building an apheresis center, getting FACT accreditation can take 2 to 3 years if you have everything. And then finding the nurses and the physicians who are also specializing it, there's not a lot. So it's a lot of pulling certain people. I think when I was at Seattle Children's, I trained 10 nurses and they were all non-apheresis nurses. So it takes a lot of time and effort, and a lot of hospitals don't have the funding or the space to support an apheresis center.
One thing that we've heard too, like obviously there's a lot of different ways you can have a bottleneck in collections. Like it's not just a limitation of the devices, but also the staff, their schedule, everything and that. But there's also the source of what is the therapy developer asking for, and processing the collection after the fact. I heard cryopreservation mentioned a lot. If that's not a capability that you have on site, you have to ship it out. Are they available? If not, like that whole window goes away even if everything else was fine. So I think that just kind of emphasizes the point of how do we have that communication between the manufacturer and the collector, because it has a rippling effect.
I have a question about how are we, for the blood centers that are going to be helping the hospitals that don't have a center or can't serve their allo and auto needs, how are you going to get reimbursed?
So I'd say these models, at least from our perspective, these models are still being developed. There's other relationships, not only with the hospitals, but even directly with the the manufacturers or the owners of the asset or the drug. They're starting to look at to build kind of gold card network apheresis programs as well. And so I think the compensation for the cell collection itself could follow different models, either directly from that community center, or even working directly with pharma.
Yeah, I've been engaged in a couple of these discussions at the national level, and the models that exist today, some were paid by the hospital in some cases we're paid by the developer, and there's another model that's being looked at for earlier collection of these apheresis products, where you can fund the collection of the therapeutic product through the sale of cells from the patient for research purposes. So some creative applications and creative approaches, but I think it's going to take some lobbying, Kate. I think it's lobbying and teamwork to figure out how we solve that for the industry.
I know the American Society of Apheresis is working on a model for reimbursement for these unique scenarios as well too. And to say lobbying or like to get support, they need help. And they need the insight of what are the barriers that we're getting as a blood center or even as a hospital, because we're not always getting reimbursed for everything. And that's the big issue. If we work with a developer, how are we going to get reimbursed through the developer? Because typically apheresis is packaged in when it's a therapeutic or a commercial product. So divvying that up is definitely a task, and it's going to take an army, I think, to figure it out, and to bring it to
Well, look, I've had the honor and the privilege of being able to represent this industry for 10 years now, and I will say with confidence, if one thing I've learned is that if you give this industry a problem, you're going to figure out how to make it work. So I think we've talked about a lot of challenges. There's also a lot of opportunities. So I just want to thank our panelists for their participation today. I want to thank BCAR and ABB for convening this important space, and for all of you for your participation. So thanks very much.